My father met Linda when I was 22 and fresh out of college. He'd been a widower for 8 years since my mother passed away from cancer, and I was genuinely happy to see him find companionship again. Linda was 15 years younger than Dad, attractive, and seemed to bring out a lighter side of him that I hadn't seen since Mom died. The courtship was whirlwind. They met at a church social in the spring, were engaged by Christmas, and married the following summer. I was Dad's best man, and despite some nagging doubts about the speed of everything, I wanted him to be happy. Linda came from the city and had never lived on a farm before. Dad owned 200 acres of prime agricultural land that had been in our family for 4 generations, along with a comfortable farmhouse and several outbuildings. It wasn't a massive operation, but it was profitable and debt-free. At first, Linda seemed genuinely interested in farm life. She asked questions about the crops, helped with the bookkeeping, and even tried her hand at gardening. Dad was smitten, constantly talking about how she was bringing new energy to the place. But I noticed things that bothered me. Linda would make comments about how outdated everything was, how the house needed modernizing, and how much the land might be worth if it were developed. She also seemed particularly interested in Dad's financial affairs, often bringing up topics about investments and estate planning. Dad brushed off my concerns when I mentioned them. "She's just trying to be helpful," he'd say. "She comes from a business background, so she thinks differently of these things." Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts, but Dad seemed happier than he'd been in years, and I didn't want to be the son who couldn't accept his father's new wife. Chapter 2. Growing Tensions. The first 2 years of their marriage went relatively smoothly, though I noticed Linda gradually becoming more controlling about farm decisions. She convinced Dad to hire a property management company to handle the day-to-day operations, arguing that he deserved to enjoy his retirement rather than working so hard. This bothered me because Dad had always been hands-on with the farm. It wasn't just his livelihood, it was his passion. He knew every acre, every piece of equipment, and every seasonal challenge. Farming wasn't work to him, it was who he was. Linda also began making changes to the house, expensive renovations that she claimed would increase the property value. Dad seemed happy to indulge her, but I could see the costs adding up. New kitchen, new bathrooms, new flooring throughout, projects that cost tens of thousands of dollars. During this time, I was establishing my own career as an agricultural engineer, working for a company that designed irrigation systems. I visited the farm regularly, usually on weekends, and maintained a close relationship with Dad. We'd often work together on small projects, maintaining equipment or checking on the crops. One of our favorite activities was tinkering with an old 1952 John Deere Model B tractor that sat in the back of the barn. Dad had bought it years earlier at an estate auction, claiming he wanted to restore it someday. It was rusty and didn't run, but Dad would talk about its potential while we cleaned parts or researched restoration tech. "This old girl has good bones," he'd say, running his hand along the faded green paint. "They don't make them like this anymore. Someday, she'll be beautiful." Linda thought the tractor was an eyesore and frequently suggested Dad should scrap it or sell it for parts. But Dad always refused, saying it was a project for retirement. Chapter 3. The Accident. Dad's death came without warning on a cold February morning. He was checking on some equipment in the barn when he suffered a massive heart attack. Linda found him several hours later when he didn't come in for lunch. He was only 62 years old and had seemed healthy, though he'd been under some stress about farm finance. The funeral was well attended, with neighbors and fellow farmers sharing stories about Dad's generosity and expertise. I was devastated, not just by the loss, but by the sudden realization that I was now truly alone. Dad had been my anchor, my mentor, and my best friend. In the days following the funeral, Linda was surprisingly composed and efficient. She immediately contacted Dad's attorney and began making arrangements for settling the estate. I assumed we'd work together on these decisions, but Linda made it clear that she was now in charge. "Your father left everything to me," she said during a tense conversation in the kitchen. "I know this is hard for you, but I need to make practical decisions about the property." I was stunned. Dad had never discussed his will with me in detail, but I'd always assumed I'd inherit at least part of the farm. It had been in our family for generations, and I'd grown up expecting to carry on that legacy. Linda showed me a copy of the will, dated just 6 months earlier. Everything, the land, the house, the equipment, and all financial assets, went to her. I received nothing except a few personal items and Dad's old pickup truck. "I'm sure your father intended to update this," Linda said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But this is what we have to work with." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Chapter 4. The Eviction. Within a week of the funeral, Linda made her intentions clear. She was selling the farm to a development company that wanted to build a subdivision. The offer was substantial, nearly $3 million for the land alone. "I can't maintain this place by myself," she explained, though she'd never shown any interest in actually farming, "and the development will provide housing that the community needs." I begged her to reconsider. offering to lease the land or even buy it from her over time. But Linda had already made up her mind. The contracts were signed, and closing was scheduled for 60 days. You need to remove any personal belongings by the end of the month, she told me. The developers want a clean property transfer. I spent the next few weeks going through Dad's things, trying to decide what to keep and what to let go. Most of his tools and equipment would stay with the property, but I was allowed to take some personal items, photo albums, his favorite chair, and a few pieces of furniture that had belonged to my mother. Linda watched my every move, making sure I didn't take anything she considered valuable. She'd hired an appraiser to catalog the farm equipment, and everything had been assigned a value for the property sale. The hardest part was going through Dad's workshop, where we'd spent countless hours together. Every tool had a memory attached. Every project reminded me of conversations we'd had. I felt like I was dismantling not just a workspace, but a lifetime of shared experiences. As I worked, I kept looking at the old John Deere tractor in the corner. Linda had mentioned several times that it needed to be hauled away before the property transfer, calling it junk that was cluttering up the barn. On my last day, I made a decision that would change everything. Chapter 5. The Overlooked Treasure. You can take that old tractor, Linda said dismissively, as I loaded the last of my belongings into Dad's pickup truck. I was going to pay someone to haul it to the scrapyard anyway. Consider it a favor. Saves me the disposal cost. I looked at the rusty 1952 John Deere, remembering all the hours Dad and I had spent talking about its potential. Linda saw worthless junk, but I saw memories and maybe something more. Dad had always insisted this tractor was special, though I'd never fully understood why. I'll take it, I said, trying to keep the emotion out of my voice. Linda seemed relieved. Good. I'll have the title transferred to you. Just get it out of here before closing. I arranged for a friend with a trailer to help me move the tractor to a storage unit I'd rented in town. As we loaded it, I noticed details I'd never paid attention to before. Despite the rust and grime, the serial numbers were clearly visible, and some of the original decals were still intact under the dirt. That evening, alone in my small apartment, I began researching the tractor online. What I discovered made my hands shake. The 1952 John Deere Model B wasn't just any old tractor. It was from a limited production run with specific features that made it highly sought after by collectors. According to several collector websites, tractors with this serial number range, especially ones with original parts and documentation, could be worth anywhere from $15,000 to $50,000, depending on condition and provenance. But as I dug deeper into the research, I found something even more interesting. Dad had been quietly documenting the tractor's history and restoration progress in a notebook I'd found among his things. His notes revealed that this particular tractor had an even more significant story. I stayed up until 3 a.m. reading everything I could find about vintage John Deere tractors and their current market value. Chapter 6. The research Dad's notebook was a treasure trove of information I'd never known existed. He'd been researching the tractor for years, documenting its history and planning a meticulous restoration. According to his notes, this wasn't just a rare model, it was a prototype. The 1952 Model B I'd inherited was apparently one of only 50 pre-production units built for testing new hydraulic systems. These prototypes were never supposed to reach the public market, but a few had been sold to farmers for field testing after the official testing. Dad had traced the tractor's ownership history back to the original test farmer, a man named Heinrich Müller, who had purchased it directly from John Deere in 19. Müller had kept detailed maintenance records, which Dad had somehow acquired along with the tractor. The notebook contained photographs of original documentation, including the test program paperwork and correspondence between Müller and John Deere engineers. Dad had even located the original shipping manifest, showing the tractor's delivery to Müller's farm in Iowa. What made this discovery even more remarkable was Dad's restoration plan. He hadn't just been tinkering randomly, he'd been systematically cataloging every original part and researching period-correct restoration techniques. His goal was to return the tractor to its exact 1952 condition, using only authentic components. I called a vintage tractor expert whose contact information I'd found in Dad's notebook. Dr. Robert Chen was a professor of agricultural history who specialized in John Deere collectibles. When I explained what I'd found, he asked me to email him photos of the serial numbers and any documentation. His response came back within hours. If what you're describing is authentic, you may have one of the most significant John Deere finds in decades. I'd like to examine it in person. I was beginning to understand why Dad had been so protective of this worthless tractor. Chapter 7. The Expert's Evaluation. Dr. Chen drove 3 hours to examine the tractor in my storage unit. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who approached the machine with the reverence of someone examining a historical artifact. "Your father was absolutely correct," he said, after spending 2 hours going over every detail. "This is definitely a prototype from the hydraulic test program. See these modification points here? These were experimental features that never made it into production. He showed me subtle differences in the hydraulic system, unique casting marks, and engineering modifications that distinguished this tractor from regular production models. Dad's documentation was equally impressive. Dr. Chen called it museum-quality research. The combination of the prototype status, the complete documentation, and the fact that it retains all original components makes this extraordinarily valuable, Dr. Chen explained. Most collectors would pay significant money just for the documentation alone. When I asked about value, Dr. Chen was careful, but encouraging. In its current condition, with this provenance, I'd estimate $75,000 to $100,000 to the right collector. If it were properly restored using your father's research and plan, it could easily bring $150,000 to $200,000. I was stunned. Linda had dismissed this as scrap metal worth maybe a few $100s, but I was sitting on what amounted to a small fortune. Dr. Chen also provided me with contacts for serious collectors and restoration specialists. There's a gentleman in California who's been looking for exactly this model for his collection, he said. He's offered $125,000 for the right prototype, sight unseen. But as I listened to Dr. Chen's enthusiasm about the tractor's historical significance, I realized I wasn't ready to sell it. This wasn't just valuable machinery. It was Dad's project, his passion, and his gift to me. I think I want to restore it, I told Dr. Chen. Chapter 8. The Restoration Project. I used my savings to rent a proper workshop space and began the restoration process using Dad's detailed plans. It was slow, meticulous work. It required sourcing authentic parts and learning specialized techniques, but it felt like continuing a conversation with Dad that death had interrupted. The restoration became my evening and weekend obsession. I'd work my regular job during the day, then spend hours in the workshop carefully disassembling, cleaning, and rebuilding each component. Dad's notes were incredibly detailed, including sources for authentic parts and contact information for specialists who could help with specific challenges. One of Dad's contacts was an elderly machinist named Frank, who had worked on vintage tractors for 40 years. When I called him and explained the project, he immediately remembered Dad. Sam was a perfectionist, Frank told me. He'd call me with questions about the smallest details, wanting to make sure everything was exactly right. He really knew his stuff. Frank became my mentor in the restoration process, teaching me techniques for metalwork, paint matching, and engine rebuilding. He also had access to a network of collectors and specialists who could provide authentic parts that were impossible to find through normal channels. The work was therapeutic in a way I hadn't expected. Each component I restored felt like a small victory, and I could almost hear Dad's voice guiding me through difficult decisions. When I discovered that the original seat could be reupholstered rather than replaced, or when I successfully rebuilt the hydraulic system using Dad's specifications, I felt connected to him in a way that transcended his death. Meanwhile, Linda had completed the sale of the farm and moved to a luxury condo in the city. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was already dating someone new, a wealthy businessman she'd met through her real estate agent. The irony wasn't lost on me that while she was spending Dad's money on a new lifestyle, I was honoring his memory by completing his most cherished project. Chapter 9. Unexpected Discoveries. 6 months into the restoration, I made a discovery that changed everything. While cleaning out the tractor's toolbox, I found a sealed envelope that Dad had hidden inside. The envelope contained additional documentation that even Dr. Chen hadn't seen, original engineering drawings and test data from the John Deere prototype program. The papers were signed by the lead engineer on the project, a man named William Morrison, who later became a vice president at John Deere. According to the documentation, this specific tractor had been used to test revolutionary hydraulic innovations that eventually became standard on all John Deere tractors. I immediately called Dr. Chen, who asked me to bring the documents to his university for authentication. When the papers checked out as genuine, his excitement was palpable. "This changes everything," he said. "These documents prove that your tractor wasn't just a prototype, it was the prototype. This is the machine that tested the hydraulic systems that revolutionized modern farming equipment." The historical significance was staggering. This tractor had played a direct role in developing technology that was now used on millions of machines worldwide. Dr. Chen estimated that with this additional documentation, the fully restored tractor could be worth $300,000 or more to the right collector. But the documents also revealed something else that made me smile. In the margins of the engineering reports, someone had written notes about the tractor's performance. The handwriting was clearly Dad's, much younger, but unmistakably his. Somehow, he'd been involved in the original testing program as a young farmer. I called my Uncle Robert, Dad's older brother, to ask about this. Uncle Robert was in his 70s and had a good memory for family history. "Oh yes," he said when I described what I'd found. "Sam worked for John Deere right after high school, before he took over the farm. He was part of some kind of testing program. I remember him being excited about working with new equipment. The pieces were falling into place. Dad hadn't just randomly bought this tractor at an auction. He'd been reconnecting with a piece of his own history. Chapter 10. The completion. It took me 18 months to complete the restoration, working evenings and weekends with Frank's guidance. When we finally started the engine for the first time, the sound was perfect. A smooth, steady rhythm that spoke of precision engineering and careful craftsmanship. The finished tractor, the green and yellow paint gleamed, every piece of chrome was polished to a mirror finish, and all the mechanical systems worked exactly as they had in 1952. Frank declared it one of the finest restorations he'd ever seen. "Your dad would be proud," he said as we admired our work. "This is exactly what he envisioned." Dr. Chen arranged for the tractor to be displayed at a vintage equipment show, where it drew crowds of admirers and serious collectors. Several people approached me with purchase offers, including the California collector Dr. Chen had mentioned, who offered $275,000 on the spot. But I wasn't ready to sell. The tractor represented more than money. It was proof that Dad had seen value where others saw junk, and that his faith in me had been justified. I'd taken his project and made it real, honoring both his memory and his vision. The attention from the equipment show led to other opportunities. A farming magazine wanted to do a feature story about the restoration, and a museum expressed interest in borrowing the tractor for a special exhibit about agricultural innovation. I also received a call that surprised me. Linda had heard about the tractor through mutual acquaintances and wanted to meet with me. She claimed she had some additional items that had belonged to Dad that she thought I might want. When we met at a coffee shop in town, Linda seemed different, less confident, more uncertain. She'd brought a box of Dad's papers that she'd found while cleaning out storage. "I thought these might be important to your tractor project," she said, sliding the box across the table. Chapter 11. Linda's regret. The box Linda brought contained more of Dad's research, including correspondence with collectors and restoration specialists dating back years. It was clear that Dad had been planning this restoration for a long time and had been building a network of contacts to support the project. But what struck me most was Linda's demeanor. The confident, controlling woman who had dismissed me from the farm seemed subdued and almost apologetic. "I've been hearing about your tractor," she said quietly. "People are saying it's worth a lot of money." I confirmed that the restoration had been successful and that the tractor was indeed valuable, though I didn't share specific numbers. Linda was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised me. "I think I made a mistake. About the farm. About everything. Your father talked about that tractor all the time, but I never understood why it mattered to him." She went on to explain that the development deal had fallen through due to environmental concern, and she'd had to sell the farm to a different buyer for significantly less money. The new owners were keeping it as agricultural land, which is what Dad would have wanted. "I could have worked with you," she admitted. "Maybe we could have found a way to keep the farm in the family, but I was scared and didn't know anything about farming. I thought selling was the only option." I listened without saying much, unsure how to respond. Part of me felt vindicated her plans hadn't worked out, but I also felt sorry for her. She seemed genuinely regretful about how things unfolded. "I know I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that your father loved you very much. He talked about you constantly, about how proud he was of your engineering career, and how much he enjoyed working on projects." She paused, then added, "He always said you were the one who really understood the farm and what it meant to the family." Chapter 12. Moving forward. After my conversation with Linda, I had some difficult decisions to make. The tractor was now worth more than I'd ever imagined, and I had several serious offers from collectors. The money would allow me to buy land of my own, and perhaps start farming again. But I also realized that the tractor's value went beyond money. It had become a symbol of Dad's faith in me, and a bridge between his generation and mine. The restoration process had taught me patience, craftsmanship, and the importance of preserving history. I decided to keep the tractor, but also share its story. I worked with Dr. Chen to create a traveling exhibit about the prototype program and its impact on modern agriculture. The exhibit would tour agricultural museums and universities, educating people about farming innovation while honoring Dad's memory. I also used some of the tractor's appraised value as collateral to secure a loan for purchasing a small farm about an hour from where I grew up. It wasn't as large as Dad's operation, but it was good land with potential for sustainable agriculture. The new farm came with its own challenges, but I approached them with confidence gained from the restoration project. I'd learned that valuable things often come disguised as problems, and that patience and persistence can transform apparent junk into treasure. Frank became a regular visitor to my new farm, helping me set up a proper workshop and sharing his knowledge about vintage equipment. We started taking on restoration projects for other collectors, building a small but profitable side business. The 1952 John Deere became the centerpiece of my workshop, a reminder of Dad's wisdom and a conversation starter for visitors. Every time I looked at it, I remembered his words about things having good bones and the importance of seeing potential where others see problems. I also maintained a relationship with Linda, who had moved back to her hometown after selling the farm. She seemed to have learned from her mistakes and was working as a real estate agent, helping families navigate property trends with more sensitivity than she'd shown me. Chapter 13. Legacy. 5 years later, my small farm is thriving, and the restoration business has grown into a respected operation. Frank and I have completed dozens of vintage tractor restorations, each one teaching us something new about craftsmanship and history. The 1952 John Deere remains the crown jewel of our collection, now insured for $350,000 but truly priceless to me. It's been featured in magazines, displayed at major shows, and has become something of a legend in collector circles. More importantly, it's helped me understand what Dad was really trying to teach me during all those hours we spent together in the barn. He wasn't just showing me how to fix things. He was showing me how to see value where others see waste, how to be patient with long-term projects, and how to honor the past while building for the future. The farm I purchased has become profitable through a combination of sustainable agriculture and agritourism. Visitors come to see the vintage equipment collection and learn about farming history, creating an additional revenue stream that helps support the operation. I've also started a scholarship program at the local agricultural college, funded partly by the restoration business profits. The scholarship helps young people pursue careers in agricultural engineering and sustainable farming, carrying forward the values Dad instilled in me. Linda and I have developed an unexpected friendship based on mutual respect and shared memories of Dad. She visits the farm occasionally and has even helped with some of the museum exhibits, sharing stories about Dad's passion for the land and his equipment. Looking back, I realized that Dad's greatest gift wasn't the tractor itself, but the lesson it represented. He taught me that value isn't always obvious, that the most important things are often overlooked by people in a hurry, and that patience and dedication can transform any. The old tractor that Linda dismissed as junk became my salvation, but more than that, it became a bridge to understanding my father's wisdom and carrying his legacy forward. Sometimes the most valuable inheritances come in the most unexpected packages. Thank you for listening to my story. It's a reminder that we should never underestimate the value of things that others overlook, and that sometimes our greatest treasures are hiding in plain sight. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life tales of hidden treasures and unexpected discovery.